We'd like to get started so that we can let you out at finish at 3 o'clock. Although the foundations people have to stay till 3:30 when their course ends. So I hope that you had a very good lunch, and let's give a round of applause to all the people who looked after that. I don't really have to introduce Brett, so just hand the mic back to him. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome back. I was delighted both by the questions I got while we were all still together and some of the conversations I was able to have over lunch. It sounds like we were getting somewhere. And I imagine that there were lots of other conversations that I had nothing to do with that were interesting as well. So I was delighted with it. I want to mention a couple things off the hop. There were a lot more questions than we had time for, and Tanis is going to forward them all to me. I have a podcast called Thinking Faith, which you can find on the Archdiocese of Regina website. And I'm going to just work through as many of those questions as I can on the podcast. Me and my co-host are always looking for material. So if you're disappointed that your question didn't get handled, check us out. One of the things we do in the podcast is when I get invited to do a talk somewhere, I say, Eric, can we sit down and talk it out and record it so I can get my thoughts straight in my head? So there's actually a recording, 90 minutes of me talking about the stuff we did this morning that will be released in the coming weeks. So it's my pre-thinking about this kind of thing. And then if I'll deal with some of the other questions that came in, and then if you have further questions, I want to be a resource for the church in that context. So we would love to have you as listeners and people interacting with us. So send us a message. If you listen to one of the podcasts at the end, there's always we say where you can send an email with a question or whatever. So, but I'll start with the questions that I already have that Tanis is going to forward on to me. Second thing I want to do is I forgot the last slide. See, I'm a PowerPoint rookie, and I forgot my last slide when I got going about health. And I just wanted to show you this because I think it's so beautiful. This is Blessed Chiara Luce Badano, who she's a millennial. She's one of the sort of most recently deceased people to become a blessed or a saint. She was a 17-year-old girl from Italy who died of bone cancer. And my brother was dying of cancer, and we started reading about Chiara Luce. And I think this quote that she has, I think all of us would want to be able to say that when we're suffering. You know, that's the option that's available to us if we don't give up and say our life is meaningless, there's no point, sickness ends everything, et cetera, et cetera. And so you see, she's lost her hair from the chemotherapy or whatever, and she still has this beautiful smile, not because she's not sick, not because she doesn't suffer, but because her meaning in life is something so much deeper than that, right? So I couldn't let that one go. I had to show it to you. That's connected with one of the questions that came in. So I obviously I could just take the next hour and a half and just do all the questions that came in. But one of the questions that came in was related to euthanasia and keeping people sort of indefinitely hooked up to technology. And I think it's worth noting that one of the steps we took as a society on the way to euthanasia was a kind of fear of death that led in many cases to over-treatment. So massive technological input in people's lives at the end to eke out an extra day, an extra 2 days, that stemmed from a fear of death and an inability to accept what's coming. And then the natural sort of follow-up to keeping people alive as long as possible was killing them, ironically and paradoxically enough. Because in both cases, you're afraid of the natural outcome, So in one case, you try to control it by prolonging indefinitely, and when that's no longer possible, we end it unnaturally. And so I think one of the things that we can witness to in the world is this dying well, where you don't have to be in a panic either way. Death doesn't have the final victory over us, and we can accept it as what's coming and God's will for us and a gift that we can make of our lives. And so, this kind of attitude is the kind of person who can face death with that. And when you see it in a 17-year-old girl with bone cancer, it's so real and it's so beautiful and desirable. Like you want to die that way, right? Rather than something else that's so afraid or locked up in itself. So I just wanted to share that because it connected with one of the questions. All right. So the second talk, the first draft of the poster that came out had this talk first. And I wrote and I said, no, can we please do the other talk first? Because this one is way harder. And I'm hoping that they like me by the afternoon before I have to do this one. I know at least some of you like me because some of you said so at the break. So this worked out well. This is a hard talk. I didn't take on the easy subjects. And this is particularly with reference to new developments in our culture around questions of human sexuality. And this is a very difficult question for the church. It's very hard politically. There's a lot of political pressure. There's a lot of ideology. There's a lot of back and forth in media. There's a lot of demonization. There's a lot of shouting. It's really hard interpersonally. Most of us will be impacted by this in our families. All of us, I think, will be impacted by this in our classrooms. Teachers are on the front line for the church on this question, and it is a very difficult question, and I don't have a lot of easy answers for you today about how we go forward, but I do think there is wisdom in the church that we can use as we consider what's in front of us. And my starting point is we're often told that we have two options when we're up against a difficult situation where maybe we're working with a person who disagrees with the church or in the context of a culture that disagrees with the church. We can either stick to our guns, we can hold down church teaching, we can speak the truth boldly in season and out of season, and that's the orthodox option, right? Or we can care for the person. We have a person in front of us who is broken, who is hurting, who needs to know that they're loved, and we have to attend to that person. And we're very often given the impression that we have to do one or the other, that it's actually, in many cases, just impossible to do both. You either have to cave on church teaching to care for the person, or stick to your guns on church teaching and then abandon the person who's in front of you, who's suffering. And it's really easy to see how we get in that problem. But what I want to do this afternoon is show that that's actually a false dichotomy. But what it's going to mean for us is the alternative, the ability to hold them together is hard work. And so we're going to learn that it's hard work, and we're going to see that there might be some ways to get better at doing that work. Pope Francis in the media coverage is very often framed, so many questions around Pope Francis are framed in terms of orthodoxy or pastoral care. Is he going to change church teaching? Is he telling us to downplay church teaching or ignore it? Is he saying, care for the person because the church has never before Pope Francis actually cared for people, but now we will? You have these, right? You have this Francis versus Benedict thing in the media. One of the funniest things I've seen is there's a Catholic blogger who took a collection of quotes from Francis and Benedict, but didn't say who had said which one, and you had to take a quiz and see if you could identify the Pope based on the quote. And it was really hard, and you got a lot of them wrong because the narrative actually doesn't hold up when you start digging underneath it. Pope Francis himself, in his own actions, in his language, he rejects this false dichotomy. One of the really sort of blunt ways in which he does it, which is sort of shocking, he speaks with very strong language in condemning things like gender ideology. I mean, he uses very powerful language, and then you'll see a picture of him with a transgender person in the Vatican giving him a hug. Right? I mean, for Pope Francis, he doesn't seem to think that upholding church teaching means excluding certain groups of people, or that being inclusive of certain groups of people means downplaying church teaching. He manages to do this, even though in the ways it's reported, it's not always balanced. We're called to do the same thing. We're not to choose one or the other. Well, I'm for the Orthodox option, or no, I'm for the pastoral care option. We actually don't get to choose between those two. So how do we hold them together? I want to start by taking an example from another context, because often we've already got our opinions about the thing we're about to talk about, and we're ready for it, and we're ready to agree or disagree already. So before we get into things that we might be quite passionate about, I want to use an example from another context just to highlight the principles involved, okay? A colleague of mine is a chaplain in Catholic healthcare facilities. He's visiting the residents. There's a woman who's there. She's an ex-Catholic. She says, it'd be great. I really miss receiving communion. And she tells him how she misses receiving communion. And the clear implication is that she's asking him to give her communion. Now, there's rare cases where you don't have access to minister of your own tradition, and there's desperate need, maybe death is imminent, whatever, where that might be not even unorthodox. It may be within the orthodox thing to give someone communion in certain very specific circumstances. But that's not her circumstance. So he's in this awkward situation. There's a person who's asking for communion, who, according to the Orthodox understanding, should not be receiving communion in the Catholic Church at this time. And he has to decide what to do. Now, if we accept this dichotomy between Orthodox and pastoral care, it's pretty easy to see two options for the chaplain in this case. He could take the Orthodox road and say, nope, no communion for you. You're an ex-Catholic. Not only are you a non-Catholic, you are in fact a person who's explicitly broken communion with the Catholic Church. Communion for you is ixnay, right? Orthodox answer. Or, in this same false dichotomy, we could say, well, what's really important is the concrete care of the person in front of us. This is a person with spiritual need. We cannot abandon this person. We should bend or even break the rules laid down by the church in order to be present and loving to this person, right? Now, I don't know about you. If that's the way that the question is framed, most Catholics I know are going to go with option B. Love is the bottom line. This is what we're about. It overrules the canonical and theological whatever arguments. This is about love, and so we break the rules for this person. I'm going to say if those were my only two options, I'd probably go for option B too, though I don't think those are our only two options, so that doesn't really mean much. But here's what happens. I think next slide. When we imagine our two options are the Orthodox answer or the pastoral care answer, we let ourselves off the hook. It's actually, both of those are really easy depending on your temperament, which one you prefer. You can feel pretty good about yourself for doing one or the other. If you're the pastoral care person, say, I'm breaking church teaching because it's the right thing to do, because I'm caring for this individual, and I'm giving them communion, and I'm moving on. Or, I am a warrior for truth, I am standing up for church teaching, I am denying this person who should not have communion, and then I'm moving on. feeling rather self-satisfied that I did the right thing in either case, right? But in either case, I've done something that's easy for me and that eases my conscience and that does not require that I stay with that person and find out more about what's going on with them and their life. What's going on behind the request of an ex-Catholic in a healthcare facility who says, I really miss communion? I can't say for certain 100%, but I can say there's a very strong case to be made, a very strong likelihood that that person is expressing a desire not simply for a consecrated host today and nothing else afterwards, but that that person is lamenting their broken relationship with the church. To seek communion in the Catholic Church, sacramental communion, is a symbol and a reality of a deeper communion with the body of Christians that is the Catholic Church. To give someone communion and move on when their deeper question might be, what is my relationship with this church that I was a part of, that I miss, and I'm sick and I might be dying? That person might be asking you for reconciliation with the church. And what a beautiful gift it would be if you could give a person reconciliation with the church over their time in a healthcare facility, maybe before their death. But if you opt for either, I'll just give you communion today and break the rules and move on, or I will shut you down and tell you that's not allowed and move on, we close off that option, that deeper possibility of reconciliation with the church that would have taken some work on our part and some journeying with the person and some talking with them and some finding out where they're at and what are their wounds and what's their history and are they angry or are they hurt and where are they at with their family and what happened with them in the church anyways and why did they leave and what's your story? What's going on? How did you end up here wanting communion from me? If I don't put in the work to find out that person's story, I can offer them cheap grace in either case. I can offer them the true answer, or I can offer them, illicit communion. But I've not taken the time to be with the person who is asking for something from Christ's church, right? So I share that with you because I want that to be a framework for us when we're presented with very difficult questions, and we're tempted to either go with let me use my scare quotes, an orthodox answer or a pastoral answer. Be very careful. If the answer is really easy on you, because you don't have to invest in the person, it's probably not pastoral or orthodox. You're probably not doing your job as a Christian. Does that make I'm a little worked up here. It sounds like I'm speaking harshly. Sorry. In either, abandoning a person is not orthodox, and it's not pastoral. The line in the Gospels about laying heavy burdens on people and not lifting a finger to help them, right? Jesus never says, don't lay heavy burdens. Actually, he says, listen, in other places in the gospel, he says, listen to every word they say. Don't do what they do, but listen to what they say. These teachings are legit. He doesn't undercut the teaching, but he says it is not an appropriate way to deal with God's people to lay on them difficult tasks and not help them. God's standards are high and they can be difficult, and especially when you're in a context where there's lots of disagreement in the broader culture, that can be really amplified, right? And it's really easy to step back and lay down the law. Here, I'll tell you exactly how it is, and not lift a finger to help anybody. Christian life is hard. If it's not hard, you're not doing it right. Like, it's not just hard for certain groups of people who in this or that historical context feel out of step. Christianity is supposed to be hard for all of us because we're all sinners. And we're held to a high standard. Jesus says crazy things like, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. But then he comes down into the muck with us and is present with us, right? And that's that balance is, you don't have the right to pronounce from on high. If you're going to uphold church teaching, you have to do it from where the people are and from where they're suffering. That's the principle of the incarnation. That's what's happening at the baptism in the Jordan. Jesus is going down into the mud with the sinners, and from there he has credibility to speak, right? All right. Again, lengthy quote. This is from Caritas in Veritate, but just check out the highlighted part. Without truth, charity degenerates into sentimentality. Love becomes an empty shell to be filled in an arbitrary way. The church's teaching is not opposed to loving a person in this or that context, but it's there to discipline us so that we don't take the easy out and leave a person hanging who might be asking a lot more of us than just an agreement with their position or their situation. Church teaching holds us accountable to stay with the person and seek their genuine good. It is so easy and so tempting to give permission, to wink and nod at church teaching. I just heard a story of a couple. They shared this story. They thought they were done in their family, but they were looking at sterilization for the husband, and they knew the church didn't think that was something people should do, and they went to their priest to talk to him about it, and he said, "Yeah, no, that's good. You've had your kids. Carry on. Get your vasectomy." And later on, they became very troubled by this and felt sort of very broken in their marriage, and they went and got it reversed, and then they weren't able to have children anymore, and there were a few miscarriages, and it was a very sad story. But they said, we thought we were going to the priest to get permission, and he was very happy to just give us permission, but what we needed was someone to accompany us because there was something that was sitting uneasy in us that we needed attending to. And what we got was a pat on the back and go carry on. And they were pastorally abandoned, and it came back to haunt them in their marriage, right? The church's teaching is there to discipline us to not abandon people to easy answers. But the imperative that the church gives us to care for every single person who comes in front of us, in our case, in our classrooms, also says you're not allowed to give hard answers from on high and leave them alone. You must stay with the person and accompany them and ask them and find out about their needs and their desires. And there was a line up there before, ask for the question behind the question. When someone comes up to you with a question about church teaching, if it's in an area of human sexuality that's very controversial, there are times and places where we need to be very clear and accurate about what church teaching is on these questions. But there are other times when what the person is really asking you is, are my parents okay? Is my friend going to hell because someone said that they're going to hell, right? When someone comes with a question like that, often the best thing to do is not give the direct answer from church teaching, but to ask them a question. Where's this coming from? How do you feel about that? What brought this on? Why are you thinking about that? Because if a person is coming to you and what they're asking is, am I loved by God? But it comes out like, can men sleep with other men? And you say no, and what they really meant was, am I loved by God? You just said no. That's what they hear, right? What's the question behind the question? So, in a context like today where there is immense ferment in the culture, and unless you guys are a really strange group, there is wide disagreement in this room right now on this question. I mean, that's a sure thing. I don't walk in here naive about that, right? If we are in a context where there is this kind of wide division between people and where a lot of the language that people use is really inflated, it's angry, there's a lot of people who are hurt, doing this work is really, really hard. And it requires a lot of sensitivity and it requires a lot of creativity. And I want to talk about those two things. I want to talk about sensitivity and how we do that. And I want to talk about creativity and how we do that. In a large majority of cases, especially with young people in your classroom who are coming with questions on this, it's very important to listen first. If they're asking you questions, ask them questions. I had an encounter just last week with a young woman. She's the leader of a club. They go by varying names, but you know which kind of clubs I mean, at one of our Catholic high schools in Regina. And she, in her presentation, said something like her LGBTQ friends are very hurt because they know what the church says about them. Now, that's a very interesting phrase, what the church says about them. She didn't say what the church says about them. She assumed we all knew what the church says about them, and it wasn't good. Now, as a theologian, I'm dying in the audience. I'm like, no, which document? Like, where, what, give me a quote. What does the church say about who, where? Like, let's be clear. So I approached her after, and I asked about this phrase, what the church says about them. Who, where, like, what is this thing? And she looked at me like I was from outer space, like, I don't know what the church says about them. And there was one obvious answer. This took me by surprise. An Old Testament passage saying a man should not lie with a man. That's what the church says about them. Now, it would be very easy for me at that point to correct her. Actually, miss, that's not what the church says about them. Here's the catechism where it talks about how all people are worthy of dignity and in the case of homosexual people, they're all unjust discrimination is to be avoided. I could have pulled out the church documents and said, here's what the church actually says about these people. And she wouldn't have cared at all. Because I was someone who had no relationship with her. I was a stranger. I was a church expert, which did not help my cause. A church expert is the enemy. And if I stepped in right there and started correcting her, I would have been perceived as being at the very least sort of daft and at most maybe like even violent, right? We use the language of violence a lot for things that aren't physical violence these days, right? So I didn't. I didn't take the opportunity there to explore church teaching. I just asked open-ended questions. Oh, how, where did you hear that? When did this come up? And I found out about the club and the teacher she works with and the club and all that kind of stuff. And now someone might say, I missed my opportunity and my duty to teach Christian faith and doctrine in that context. But I think there was a 99.9% chance that if I tried, it would have been a waste of everybody's time and it would have pushed a person further away rather than inviting them closer. Now, interestingly, the reason this young woman was at the talk at all was because she loves and trusts the youth coordinator for our archdiocese. Our youth coordinator, Michelle Braden, is surrounded by kids from the margins, addicts, LGBT people from broken homes and families. They flock to her, and they know in cases where they're living contrary to church teaching, they know she disagrees with them. And they don't care because they know she loves them. This woman who disagreed with the woman who invited her to give the talk knew that she disagreed, and she came anyways because she felt welcome and safe there. Now, if I step in as the theologian and start lecturing her about all the theological and scriptural distinctions that she's messing up, and I'm not going to help anything. The person who can help her is Michelle, who she loves and trusts, and who she can talk to. Now, a theologian in a parish event does not have the relationship to step in to those kind of contexts, but teachers do. I met that woman for 15 minutes one night. You spend days and months and years sometimes with students. And sometimes you're one of the only people they can talk to, right? You have the context to care for the person so that when the time is right for clarity on church teaching, you can offer it, right? But you only get to do it, and you only have any chance of doing it effectively if you're actually in a relationship with a person who might come to trust you. Now, what this means, here's the third point. If you're going to be in that position where the question might come, you got to know what you're doing. Now, I said this morning, not everyone needs to be an expert on everything. And so sometimes knowing your stuff means knowing someone else who knows their stuff that you can go ask, in a pinch when you really need it, right? But misrepresentations and misunderstandings of church teaching on this question are rampant. I would say I'm fairly confident that I hear church teaching on these questions misrepresented more often than I hear them accurately represented. It happens all the time, and it happens both by people who reject church teaching and may not be all that interested in presenting it accurately because they want to make it look bad, but it also happens from people who think they are representing church teaching, and some of whom even think they agree with church teaching end up misrepresenting it. We can maybe do a little bit of detail on some of those issues in Q&A. We won't spend the whole talk on getting that down exactly. But people have heard things that are damaging that the church never said. How many of us have heard it said that the church says homosexual or same-sex attracted people are disordered? Have any of us heard it said that they're disordered? I suspect more, I'm seeing a few hands, I suspect more of us have heard that. This is common language in the media, that the church calls homosexual or same-sex attracted people disordered. I won't go into all the detail about where that language comes from, but what I will tell you is this: a human person, according to the Catholic Church, is not even the kind of thing that can be disordered. Human people cannot be disordered. And so if any child or young person comes to you and has heard that the church says that they are disordered, or their friend is disordered, or their parents or their aunt or their uncle or whoever, the church says people cannot be disordered. Acts can be disordered. Inclinations towards acts can be disordered. I do them most every day. So do all the rest of you, right? We all do The Catechism calls lying disordered. It doesn't say people are disordered. It says language is ordered towards the communication of truth. Therefore, language that is not ordered to the communication of truth is disordered. It doesn't say people. People aren't, right? That's just one example. A second example, how many people have gotten the impression from somewhere that the Catholic Church thinks we need really rigid gender distinctions? Some of us have heard this. It's not uncommon that that's the presentation of church teaching. Pope Francis actually says in Amoris Laetitia that one of the things that would help in our current context around transgender question is less rigid gender distinctions. If our cultures had less rigid images of masculinity and femininity for young people, fewer people would say, oh my goodness, I don't fit the ideal. We live in this strange time where if you go into children's toy stores and clothing stores, there are hyper-feminized and hyper-masculinized clothing and toys for young people. If you heard about like girls' Lego, they made Lego just for girls that has girly colors. Like, what is that? I mean, if that's not a rigid gender, right? So now you're a girl who's like, I didn't think there was anything wrong with the original Lego. Am I not a girl? Like, what's going, right? The Catholic Church is not in favor of like uber strict, over-defined, rigid gender roles, right? And Pope Francis says as much. So those are just two examples. I could spend far too much time going into more of them. The point is, those kinds of examples actually do damage to people. People hear things that they think the church says about them, and they feel condemned by it, and it's not even what the church actually says. So it's really important to be clear on those things. If you don't know, find someone who does, right? A fourth thing on sensitivity. Very few of us have the credibility to speak to these questions in today's culture. You have credibility if you were investing in the young people, if you're actually with them. But another way people have credibility if it is actually their own experience. And so people we really need to listen to, because not that we don't listen to other people, we should be listening to all kinds of people, because this is a new question and we haven't figured out everything on it, and it is also a time for listening. But one of the groups of people that we really need to listen to that are extremely marginalized, because they get marginalized by both sides, are Catholics and others who've gone through these struggles and found freedom in church teaching. And some of their stories are remarkable. I have a friend, and this is his story, and he's so nervous. He says, when I was in school, if no one would have told me that I was a man and that I could be a man, and that these other things that I was worried about my masculinity didn't really matter all that much and weren't essential to being a man, I probably wouldn't have the beautiful life that I have today with my family. And I may have ended up in a very destructive lifestyle because I was on that path. And so for him, he's very anxious that kids are not given the opportunity to hear what he heard, right? So to hear the voices of the people who've gone through that and say, what was their experience? Now, this ties in with the next point. These people are not sticks with which to beat other people whose experience does not map onto theirs, right? You don't get to say, look, he got his stuff sorted out, so you need to too, right? We have now the pattern for you. Just think like this guy thinks, and then you'll be okay. That's just pronouncing from on high and leaving people to their own devices again, right? But rather, engage with the person's experience. What did this person say that sounds like your experience? What did he or she say that doesn't? How does this relate to your experience of yourself, your growth in self-understanding, et cetera, right? These open-ended questions that allow engagement with real people and not just with categories. Oh, you're one of those, right? We know how to fix those. You just do like that other person, right? No, every person is a unique individual. But human experience is common enough that we can learn from and measure our experience over against others. We've all had this experience where somebody talks and says something and we're like, oh, they just said my experience better than I could ever say it myself. And that builds up communion and understanding. So giving the opportunity for those voices, not only those voices, but certainly including those voices, because they can speak in a way that most of us can't. And the last point on sensitivity, Pope John Paul II, actually we can maybe go to the next slide, because I think it's got the quote. Pope John Paul II, right at the beginning of his pontificate, had this beautiful line in Redemptoris Missio that says, the church proposes, she imposes nothing. In fact, Archbishop Gagnon, at the very beginning of the day when he introduced me, said something about the Christian proposition, right? Church teaching is not even the kind of thing that can be imposed. I mean, you can try, but when we do it, the church has never come out looking good when we've tried to use the power of the state or coercion or fear or whatever to impose church teaching. It always backfires. The church shouldn't impose, and even when it tries to impose, it really can't. It just ends up shooting itself in the foot because it doesn't have the mechanisms to impose. It needs to rely on the state or other things, and that always gets us in a heap of trouble, always. But the church proposes. And so when we teach something, one way we can think about this is church teaching always should be able to be received. Now, let me qualify. There are certain times when you can't be responsible for how other people react, right? Sometimes people got their own stuff going on, and it doesn't matter how well you do it. They're going to be angry at you, and Jesus says, shake the dust off your feet and go to the next town, right? Sometimes people are just not in a place to listen, and it's not your fault. But in as much as you take responsibility for what you're doing, the gospel has to be presented as an offer of life and not as a threat of death. And when people hear it as a threat of death, they will not accept it. This might seem to work in a Christian culture where the church has high prestige and everyone seems to think that being in the church is the right thing to do and whatever else. Then people might sort of go along to get along when church teaching is being imposed. But usually that just sows the seeds of discontent that leads to the collapse of the Catholic culture as soon as the apparatus that held it up is gone. We've seen historic examples of this all across the Catholic world where things just fall down completely because it wasn't deeply rooted in the acceptance of a proposal, but it was sort of taken from on high as imposed in, this is how the culture works, right? Quebec is one of the great examples in 2,000 years of church history of the sort of collapse of Catholic culture. It has to be made as an offer of life so that a person can say, this actually works. This makes my life make sense. This gives me tools for working with my problems, my questions. This is a place where I feel like I belong, where I can work through whatever it is. If people feel the gospel is presented in that way, you have a possibility. But if it's agree with church teaching or condemnation, in a culture like this one, they'll just say, no, thank you. I'm moving on, right? We don't have the cultural position to use those kinds of means, but even when we do have that cultural position, we shouldn't use them anyways. They don't work. All right, so that was sensitivity. Next is, here's Pope Benedict saying basically the same thing as John Paul. The church does not impose but freely proposes the Catholic faith. And so we can go to the next one. All right. So this is my last piece on this. To respond in a context where the church and the culture are so far apart, and when we as a church, as different members of the church, disagree with one another and have a hard time talking to each other and don't know or understand what the other person is saying, we need a lot of creativity. Now, what I don't mean by creativity is freelancing, right? Just go make some stuff up and give it a try and see if it works, and don't pay much attention to the rules. Real creativity actually doesn't work like that. If you actually look at maybe, let's say, artistic examples of creativity, think of a jazz musician, right? Now, I can't really play the piano. I can plunk around a few things, do a few scales, but if you just brought a piano out here and said, here's a piano, there's no music for you to follow, just be creative. Just play us something. You all know what that would sound like, right? It would be terrible. But a jazz musician who knows the scales inside out and backwards can sit down with no music and create something beautiful. because the scales are not just a limit that says, here's what you're not allowed to do. They're a structure that gives you the freedom to do all kinds of things you could never do without that structure. And so the rules are not there they're not there to limit creativity, but they're there to give them structures so that they can actually turn into something real and beautiful. The greatest and most creative Christians are the saints. Not because they're rule breakers, but because the rules are not just an external thing for them that they have to live by, but the whole logic of the Christian life has been built into them so that when they're faced with a difficult situation or a difficult person, they don't say, oh, hold on, let me go, find out what the right answer is. Let me check my flow chart for how to respond to you and your problem. But they have a remarkable creativity of responding to the person in the moment. Read some of the quotes from Mother Teresa when people would ask her questions or confront her with different issues. The remarkable creativity that she had because it was lived out from something deep inside. So what kinds of things can we do to build our own capacity for creative engagement on really hard questions? Because there's no easy answers, but we can set ourselves up to be better equipped to respond. I want to talk about two things: study and prayer. All right, the first thing on study is to recognize, and this goes back to what I said earlier about know your stuff in terms of church teaching. Church teaching on many issues, but on these issues in particular, is very often lost in translation. The church is using a set of language that the world does not use. It's using a set of philosophical categories that the world does not use. And so lots of times when there's miscommunications, it's not simply ignorance or ill will. Sometimes it's just lost in translation. These are difficult concepts, and we're coming from such different viewpoints that we have a really hard time talking to each other. Getting to know church teaching in response to the problems that the world is presenting us with. What are the real questions out there? What are we faced with? And what are the best answers we have? And maybe we don't have the best answers yet. Maybe we're still working on responses, right? But we're engaging with where are the real questions coming from, and how does this relate to the church's understanding? And where does the church have very definitive things to say, and where does it not have very definitive things to say, but has places for learning and understanding? Just knowing the difference between some of those things is important. The second thing on this is it's very easy, especially if we disagree with the church, it's very easy. This happens, by the way, on every issue. Social media is doing this to all of us, that we just read things that we already agree with. Social media feeds us over and over. It knows what we like, and it feeds us more of that. And so instead of being exposed to more and more points of view, we get exposed to fewer and fewer points of view, and we read things that already confirm what we already think. This is actually extremely dangerous, both for ourselves, but it's very dangerous for a culture to have a bunch of people who never read each other or what people who disagree think. So if we, say, disagree with church teaching, it would be very easy to read more and more things that advocate against church teaching. It would also be very easy to do the opposite, right? To read more and more things that are supportive. It is valuable that we are familiar with what people who disagree with us think on these issues. That's extremely valuable. The work of translating doesn't work if you don't know what the other person's language is, right? Knowing what people who disagree are saying is very important work. A second step on this is, as Catholic teachers in particular, but as Catholics in general, we do have a certain responsibility to know what the church has to say for itself. If I disagree with church teaching and I read a lot of things that advocate against church teaching, there's a very good chance that I'm actually misrepresenting church teaching or misunderstanding it. And so it's important to say, what does the church actually have to say for itself? How does it respond to this or that accusation or misunderstanding or maybe just honest question, right? How does the church respond to that? So be careful with your reading to not get locked into an echo chamber, right? All right. And the last thing, and I'm going to finish in under an hour. That was my plan. The last thing I want to talk about is prayer. I have a definition of prayer up there. It's not the only definition of prayer. There's 25 or 30 pretty good definitions of prayer. But I like this definition of prayer. I think it's a very helpful definition of prayer because it helps us to see, to some degree, how prayer works. Anyone ever had a situation where you're in a debate on, like, Facebook and you type up, like, 4 paragraphs of devastating rhetoric? You're going to, like, lay low your opponent. I know we all stopped doing that in 2012, but like it was hard to learn, right, how to behave ourselves on Facebook when it first came out, and there were these long threads, and some people still do that, but we mostly know to ignore them. When you're in, like, the massive Facebook debate and it consumes your life, and even when you're not on Facebook, you're, like, winning the argument in the shower, right? Has any of you have ever lost an argument in the shower? No, I'm undefeated. When we're so sure that we've got, like, the final answer and we're going to nail them with this devastating 4 paragraphs, and we actually stop for a second before we hit enter, and we look back at those 4 paragraphs and we say, actually, I wrote a very devastating 4 paragraphs 2 hours ago, and that also didn't end the debate, because this crafty person on the other side isn't listening carefully, and they're going to give me 4 paragraphs of their own or whatever. And so what you do, instead of hitting enter, is you stop for 15 seconds and say a Hail Mary, and then go read the 4 paragraphs again, and then you just delete them. Has anyone been in that experience? Right? Because when we prayed for 15 seconds, we got outside of the point of view that was overwhelming our imagination to the point where we were just in combat mode. And we saw now that there's actually another person involved here, or people, who are real people with their own fears and anxieties and deep commitments, and we're not actually getting anywhere in this, Facebook flame out. And so I'm actually going to, like, offer an olive branch here and not continue this. Because all it took was 15 seconds for God to show you that you're not the center of the world, right? And one of the great impediments to our creativity is our own egos. When I'm faced with a question, I'm a theologian, right? Where's my ego going to go? Better get this question right. Give them the right answer. Be precise and clear. Don't let them leave here with the wrong answer. You got to nail this. You are the theologian, right? But if I step back for a minute and say, actually, theologians aren't the be-all and end-all, and sometimes there's an encounter with another person that doesn't need first and foremost the accurate theological exposition, but maybe we need to start somewhere else, then my ego as a theologian just got decentered, and now I'm considering the other person, right? And now I have a possibility to be creative by responding to the real person and their real need, and not responding to my own expectation of my responsibility in this situation, right? That's my own example. You can probably think of your example. Our egos get in the way all the time because we always feel fragile, exposed, at risk, vulnerable. If you're in the Catholic Church and you agree with the Catholic Church about its teaching on human sexuality, you feel vulnerable, exposed, and ready to be ridiculed at any time the subject comes up. Guess what? If you're in the Catholic Church and you disagree with the Catholic Church on the Church's teaching on human sexuality, you feel vulnerable and exposed and ready to be exposed to ridicule at any time that comes up. Nobody feels safe We're in a room full of people who probably disagree with each other, and we've all had awkward conversations where we both felt that we were the persecuted minority. We all feel scared to deal with this, and so our own egos come in to protect us, and when we do that, we can't be open to the other person, whether it's my colleague who disagrees with me on church teaching, or whether it's the student in front of me who's presenting a challenge to me that I have to be present with this person, and I can't just give them either, here's church teaching, follow it or else, and I can't just say, oh yeah, wink and nod, don't worry about church teaching, it's going to change next week anyways. When I don't have those options, I need to be able to get outside of myself and see that other person at the center of this drama. And we see so much of our lives as we're the center. Social media is terrible for this too, right? We're all our own movie star, where we curate our own personalities. We're all the center of the show all the time. And prayer takes us back outside of that and allows us to focus on another person, and that opens up the possibility for a creative response to them. I can't give you a bunch of easy answers about what that creative response is. I'm sorry, I can't actually do that. But I can tell you that if you put in the time in the library and on your knees, studying and praying, you will be better equipped when you disagree with someone else in the church on this, when you're faced with a person who needs your care now. Here's the thing, maybe you're faced with a person who actually is at the point where they need to hear church teaching. That's not always easy to be able to tell. And if your own ego is out of the way, it's a lot easier to be able to say, this is the time to introduce it. They're offering themselves for that at this point, right? So prayer and study, super important. When we live at a time in history where there's this much tension around a given question, we really want to duck the tension. We'd rather it just resolve itself in our preferred way quickly. It's not going to happen. We're faced with new questions, and this is going to work itself out slowly, and we're going to look back in 50 years, and things are going to look a lot clearer in hindsight. But right now, we're stuck in the middle of it. And as long as we're in that, what the church needs is saints who can endure that tension and not abandon either the teaching of the church or the care of the individual person. And as teachers, we're called to be in that space to hold that tension. And as we do it, and as we put our own heart and soul into that kind of work, that's the places where we're going to find hope and healing and creativity for ourselves and for our kids and for our culture. So I invite you to that really hard work, and we'll move to Q&A. So thank you. Thanks. Ooh. Yes. This is so hard. In my office at the Archdiocese, I get phone calls and emails from people who are in a panic about what's happening in our schools. And sometimes they're justified. They've brought me some handouts that should not be in our schools. There are like some things that should not be going on, right? But they don't always have all the information. And so trying to reassure them that we're trying to work on this, but when I have a feeling that this is referring to a couple of individuals or families, and I know we have the same people. I know who they, right? And they're a bit frantic, right? Like they're losing sleep. This is weighing on their hearts, and so there's a real temptation to view them as kind of the enemy or the annoyance that needs to be dismissed, but they are also a person in need of pastoral care. They are also a person whose inner life is really disturbed about this, right? And so to invite those people as well into prayer and study. I mean, I ask those people, like, pray for our teachers, pray for me, pray for our bishop, right? Like, and when you pray for people, it is very hard to demonize them. by the way. Have you ever had it, right? Someone who you're really upset with? I went to confession once, and I confessed anger at a couple people who I thought had done me wrong, and I still think they had done me wrong. But that doesn't mean anger was good for me, right? And so I confessed anger, and the priest said, pray for it. My penance was to pray for these people who had wronged me. Well, holy cow, it took about 2 minutes for me to think that the whole thing was trivial. I mean, I still think they were wrong, but who cares? Like, it's very hard to demonize people who you pray for. So pray for these people and invite them to pray. Because in my experience, these people actually believe in prayer. So, like, you're on their side when you're asking them to pray, right? So that's one first step, is pray for them, pray with them, invite them to pray. It can be very difficult, but one of the things we can get good at with our creativity is to make sure these people also feel heard. Because these people do not feel heard, which is why they keep repeating themselves louder and louder, right? I had a woman phone my office the other day, "What are you doing about the Canada Summer Jobs Program?" And she called, she was ready to fight because the church wasn't doing enough, to... Now, like every second bishop in Canada has sent a letter to the... Anyways, that day, I was drafting a letter for the bishop, and he was setting up a meeting with our local MLA, right? Like that day, we were doing that work. So I was like, oh, this is great. Like, yeah, we're working on it. We're writing this letter. We're setting up a meeting with the MLA, or MP. We're doing all this stuff. And then she was like, she was all ready to fight, and there was no fight left. Why isn't the church doing any? Oh, shoot. And then it sort of sputtered out. She spent 5 or 10 minutes trying to fight, and then kind of not fighting, and because she felt heard, but she had to calm, because she probably had to get really geared up to even make the phone call, right? She had to build up her own courage and be ready to go. Sometimes these people are so nervous and anxious, they've built up their courage to come in ready for the fight, and they need to be heard. And so if we can find ways of letting them know they're heard, we can take down some of that anxiety, right? Now, sometimes there's really actually legitimate things that like should not have happened, right? There are things that are said or handed out or whatever in our schools that should not have happened in our schools, and then we actually have to do something, because if we don't do anything, we're creating problems on all kinds of areas, both in our classroom, but feeding this kind of thing. So that doesn't mean we need to be like really harsh sort of punishers of everything, but we do need sometimes at least to take some decisive action that we can point to and say, like, actually that was a mistake, this won't happen again. We had the U of R Pride group was invited into one of our elementary schools and got kids chanting these slogans and different things like that, and like that shouldn't have happened. And so the school board, when that came up, said, yeah, we screwed up. That shouldn't have happened. We've put protocol in place so that won't happen again, right? So that, but that's a hard one. There, I went on too long on that one, but it's a tricky one. Yes, and a slight caveat. We support everyone. We support people. I do not, it would be a scandal, actually, if I said, because I'm an employee of the Catholic Church, I am ostracizing my LGBT family member, right? The tricky part is, does supporting the person mean publicly advocating for stances against church teaching? No, that's not what supporting a person means. So as an employee of a Catholic system, having an LGBTQ family member does not mean now I'm publicly advocating against church teaching. What do we mean by support? But I mean, in all the normal human ways of supporting our family members, of being with people for their life events that matter to them, of being there as a person to talk to when they're having a hard time, of course. And here's this allows me to say something else that's really important. if I were to say no to this, I give an impression that there are sinners and there are sinners, right? All y'all other sinners, I support you, and my family's full of sinners, right? I support them in all kinds of ways, right? I'm glad they support me. I'm one too. If I say, here's a category of sinners that gets a different treatment, then I've said something that I mean, completely wrong, completely misrepresents church teaching. One of the things we have to do on this question is avoid giving the impression that sexual sin, or even more specific cases of it, are like the one kind of sin that matters. All the rest of us that cheat on our taxes and gossip and do all the other things and lose our temper with our kids and all the things that we do, well, that's kind of acceptable human nature. Everyone does that. But the sexual sin people, especially the people who seem to be on the different side of us in a pitted sort of cultural battle, they're the unclean. No. Sinners are sinners. Don't make categories with it. Like, now this is hard because within the culture we're presented with a category of people, right? So there's a real temptation to act as if this is a special category of sinner because it presents itself as a category. But one of the things we really have to do in terms of getting the translation right is there's no special categories of sinners. And so, would I go visit someone in prison in my family if I was a Catholic? Of course I would. It just doesn't amount to advocating for positions against church teaching. But in all the and if you really genuinely support a person, turns out it actually doesn't, people are actually able to live with people who don't publicly advocate for their issues, right? Like they hang out with Michelle Braden, who disagrees with them on church teaching because they love her and she supports them, right? You don't have to agree with everything everyone says to support them. But that's difficult because our culture likes to frame it like, if you don't agree with everything I say, you're not supporting me. Well, we just have to show by our actions that that's not true, right? Does that go on to a next page, or is that the whole thing? I don't know. Okay, anyways, I'll take it that that's the whole thing. So, this is really tricky because let's, again, move it out of the category. Here's a category of people that are not allowed to do whatever they're allowed, The appropriate category for thinking about this is, can we work in a Catholic school while publicly living and advocating against the church's teaching on this issue or any other issue? That's actually the category within which this should be treated. Now, openly gay, what do we mean by that? There's a really interesting case in Ontario where an openly gay man was serving at the altar in his parish, and some members of the parish approached the pastor and said, "This guy's gay. He's living with his partner. They're openly gay. He can't be serving at the altar," and got him removed. The guy wrote a letter to his bishop and said, "Yes, I'm gay. Yes, this person is my partner. Yes, we live together, and we live according to church teaching." And the bishop reinstated him. He's openly gay, but he is not advocating against church teaching, and in fact, he's professing to try to live by church teaching. So the categories are really hard to parse out. How do I say who's doing what and where, right? If it comes down to a public rejection of church teaching in your life, in this issue or any other issue, it's very difficult to be a person who's responsible for transmitting the church's teaching in an educational institution. But there can be really dicey situations. You know what? One that kills me, related to this, Catholic teacher gets pregnant out of wedlock, loses her job, or has an abortion and keeps her job. because nobody knows that she's living outside of church teaching, right? Because the abortion could be kept secret, but the pregnancy couldn't. That one kills me. When, like, a person can, you can be pregnant and unmarried and say, like, I'm not advocating against church teaching. I made a bad decision at one point, but God has blessed me with a child, and I'm going to take responsibility for that, right? So, but this is the broader umbrella category within this falls is how do we as teachers live when we disagree with church teaching or when we're living outside of it. And some things are more public than others, and sometimes that's a really dicey call to make. But I would say, at the very least, broadly defined, being openly gay shouldn't disqualify you, right? You can. It's a question of, are you working against church teaching in your capacity as a church teacher or living counter to that? But there can be endless nuances in those kinds of employment questions, and I don't envy people who have to make those decisions because that can get really dicey. So I wrote a book. When Leah Perot was here, she might have had our books for sale. How Far Can You Go? A Catholic Guide to Sex and Dating. So that's, we think, a good sort of intro for teachers and students. If you want to start digging, there's a few places. Of course, most of us will have heard of the Theology of the Body, which is a John Paul II sort of large project of unpacking church teaching in terms of human anthropology. So the question isn't, first of all, what should you or shouldn't you do in the bedroom, but what kind of thing is a human person and what leads to their flourishing. There are better and worse popular versions of that, and the original is not accessible to most readers. So while I can recommend the Theology of the Body, go look at it, doesn't mean I personally endorse every articulation of it in public. But it's been very helpful for a lot of people. I think one of the things to read nowadays in light of new questions about transgender and homosexuality is the actual stories of the people who've worked through this and how it relates to their own Catholic faith. I think that's really important work to do. I should have a better answer for one single book to recommend to you than my own book. So I'm gonna think on that actually. But I mean, looking at the Theology of the Body is good, but looking at the experience of these of people who've lived it is really important. I wish I had a book to just throw at you, but you can buy my book at some point. But I'll move on from there. There's books that I like, but I don't like everything about them, and I'm nervous to. Yes, just like everybody else. So there's nothing about being or feeling or thinking that you're in one of these categories that makes you any different from anyone else in terms of being a sinner. Like there's now, are there sinful things that people do that may be more likely for some people? Yeah, but that's actually also the same for everybody else too. So, for example, does the church think anal sex is good for human relationships? No, doesn't. But here's the deal. It's not wrong because the people do it are gay. The church doesn't specify. If you're gay and you do that, it's not good for you. If you're straight and you do that, it's not good for you. If you're two straight men, it's not good for you. If you're a straight man and a straight woman, it's not good for you. Like the church's concern that action doesn't build up human community and flourishing is not predicated on the fact that gay people do it. That's not the issue. The issue is this is not ordered towards building up life and community. It it can be painful, it can be degrading, it can say something about the dominance of one person over another instead of a mutual exchange in the sexual act. That's why historically it's been used so brutally in military takeovers and in prisons and whatever else, because the act itself says something not positive about the person on one end of it, right? The church does not say it's wrong because gay people do it. So this is one of the things about lost in translation. If someone says, is gay sex wrong? Gay is not the issue. That's not what the church is talking about. It doesn't care who's doing it. And so your self-understanding or identity or whatever as gay has nothing to do with which acts the church thinks build up life and human communion and which ones take it down. And so that's an important distinction, but certainly just understanding myself as gay doesn't make me any more of a sinner than anybody else. And the same thing would apply to transsexual people. Now, the church has teachings about mutilating the body that apply not just to transsexual people, right? The church says none of us should mutilate our bodies. The mutilation of the body is a rejection of the gift of the Creator. It doesn't say because some transsexual people have certain surgeries, therefore they're wrong. It says, in general, mutilating the body is not good for us. And so if you were in a given situation where you would be tempted towards that kind of mutilation, that's tricky for you because that's just like any other sin that any of us might be tempted to do for any other situation. But the nature of the sin has nothing to do with the identity of the person. That we have to be so clear on that. It doesn't say anything about the person. The person is not any more or less a sinner than anybody else. The question is mutilating our body good for us or not? In what circumstances or not? Is anal sex good for us or not? In what circumstances or not? But not are these people somehow more sinners than the rest of us. I'm on a way to obtain reputable short daily reminders regarding church. Interesting. Probably. There's lots of resources available in terms of scripture, like daily scripture reflections. You can get them from a host of different priests or lay people who offer daily or weekly scripture reflections. Francis's Twitter account, right? Twitter is going to give you stuff in small bites. One that's actually pretty good is Father Mike Schmitz has short videos, like 6 to 8 minutes, from Ascension Presents that often deal with church teaching that are quite accessible and generally, I think, quite reliable and reputable. So I don't think they're daily. They're maybe weekly or bi-weekly or something. Anyways, but yeah, he shows up on my Facebook feed all the time. So that might be one to look into, Father Mike Schmitz. He does actually, the reason I recommend him is he does actually go into concrete questions of church teaching with a lot of regularity. That's a lot of his material, and it's quite accessible and reputable. If there's others that you find, feel free to share them with one another, but that would be one I would start with for sure. Bishop Robert Barron has a lot of good stuff that people would find on YouTube and other places. He's all over the place. So those two would be good starts, yeah. Yes, but not as church and religion, right? We don't get to walk into Ottawa and say, hey, we're the Catholic Church, and so we're going to tell you what you should do on this policy. And our say carries a lot of weight because, we're the Catholic Church, and you should listen. How do we engage in public policy? Well, guess what? All the members of the church in Canada are also citizens of Canada, right? And other religions, religious people are citizens too. And so when we're told that you need to keep religion out, a lot of times what we're being told is your conviction is disallowed because of your because of your religious identity. So we often find in many public issues, our position is dismissed, even if we make no appeal to religious authority. If we make an argument about abortion from purely scientific ground, now purely, I said this morning, there's no neutral, right? But when we don't invoke religious authority in our arguments about, for example, euthanasia, we just had this a couple years ago. Church did not invoke religious authority in its arguments about euthanasia. It tried to argue at the level that we could hold in common as reasonable people. We were still dismissed as, well, you just believe that because you're religious, don't come in here imposing your religion on me. So it's important to recognize we're not trying to impose religion. We are citizens with convictions in a democracy, and we have a right to make our case in public. And sometimes we do that as a group. Maybe our bishops get together and write a letter. Well, guess what? There's lobby groups of every stripe imaginable doing the same thing, right? Gun owners, sheep farmers, who have common interests, so they get together and they have spokespeople who are good at what they do, who talk to the broader public and talk to our politicians about what they think would be good policy. Religious people are, of course, as welcome to do that work as anybody else in a democracy. So don't let them tell you you're not allowed in here because you're religious. This goes back to the false neutrality. Everybody gets to participate here. Now, if you're a religious group and you decide that all the arguments you're going to make are from religious authority and you're going to do that in the public sphere, you are free to do that, and then you are free to lose the debate. Right? I mean, that's your choice. If you want to invoke religious authority that nobody else recognizes, then you'll lose. You're allowed to do it. No, I mean, don't tell people they can't, but you might tell people that it's not a recommended best practice, right? But no, by all means, religious people with religiously informed consciences should be participating in the political process and shouldn't be excluded from it because of that. So the answer is yes, but not because religion has a privileged position, but because we're all citizens, right? We got about 9 minutes. Oh, that's a good one. This is very important for getting the translation right. Okay. Basically, no. Although it's interesting when you read the Catechism, the Church basically doesn't actually have a position on. Let me state that more carefully. The Church does not have a position on where these desires or identities come from. There's no church-sanctioned theory for why people feel this way or identify this way. The Catechism says the psychological origins of this are largely unknown. And it says most people experience this as a burden and not as a choice. Now, the qualifier I want to put is it's very important to recognize that there is no one answer to why a person comes to identify in that way. There's no cookie cutter. If there are 1 million gay people, there's probably 1 million sets of combinations of factors that led to that. And there will be significant overlap, sure, between a lot of them, but we don't know. But every sort of reputable engagement with this recognizes that people don't experience this as a choice. Can you make a series of choices in your life that make it harder for you to live the Church's teaching? I can. Can you? Can gay people? Of course. All of us can make a series of choices that make living out the Christian life harder. That's not the same thing as choosing to be gay, right? So that's an important distinction, right? I make bad choices, and then, we're creatures of habit. You make a bad choice, next time that same choice comes up, is it easier or harder to make a good choice? It's harder if you make the bad choice. And you make a good choice, it's easier to make the good choice next time. So we all live a life going from choices to choices that make certain things harder or easier for us. But that is not the same thing as saying people choose to be gay at all. So no, but also where it comes from is very complicated, right? This is really tricky. We all have different perceptions of this. Some people will tell you that the church, they can go to church for 20 years and never hear a word about sex in a homily. And other people will tell you that the church talks about nothing but sex. It's remarkable. And there's actually truth in both of those experiences. Sexual sin gets a lot of press. And it comes up a lot. It sells newspapers. And so whenever things come up, some people have said the church isn't obsessed with sex. The media is obsessed with sex. They report everything we say about it. But when we talk about social justice, right? Who's obsessed with sex? How many homilies do you hear about sex in a year? It's also very difficult in terms of preaching. Preaching is tricky. If you want to talk about something like artificial contraception in preaching, you've got a group of people, some are 3 years old, some are 90 years old. It's not really a live question for those groups, right? You've got a whole host of people in between. You've got lots of people, odds are, who are actively acting against church teaching, like maybe yesterday. This is a hard thing to do, and church teaching on this can be so easily misunderstood that priests will really be careful, because in a homily, there's no option for Q&A after. So if I misrepresented church teaching, or if someone misheard something or misunderstood something, they might go home with that and never get it cleared up, right? So people are hesitant to talk about certain topics in certain contexts. So there's a lot of factors. But here's one last one to consider. One of the reasons the church is actually so concerned about sex, because the church actually is, it's not only concerned about sex, it's actually really concerned about a lot of other things. Like if you follow what comes out of the Vatican, they talk about war and peace all the time. They talk about like just distribution of goods all the time. Like there's a lot of things that get a lot of play, and sex is one of them, and it flares up when there's certain public issues. So the church isn't uniquely obsessed with sex, but the church does care deeply about sex. And if you've paid any attention to the impact of sex in your life and the life of the people around you, you know why. Because sex has great power to do great damage to human relationships. There are students in your classrooms who are in really bad situations because their parents' sexual lives have led to a kind of breakdown in their family, and they are confused and angry and, right? Misuse of sex is one of the easiest ways to destroy people's lives. It's extremely common that people who are the victims of sexual violence, people who are the victims of infidelity, all kinds of misuses of sex lead to really concrete, difficult circumstances in people's lives. If all of the parents in your classrooms had their sex lives in order, your job would be immensely easier. There's no way around it, right? So the church cares a lot about sex because it cares a lot about people. And sex is a very powerful thing. But we do need to be careful to not pretend it's the only thing that matters, right? And I think in general in our church, despite how it's reported in the media, we talk about a lot of other things that really matter too. One more? Okay. Thank you. It was a delight to be with you. Father Len.
About 15 minutes ago, I got tagged with the responsibility of saying thank you. So I'm going to wing this one. Brett, your theology professors at Regis College in Toronto would be proud of you. Because when we wanted to find a speaker who would give us a thought-provoking, balanced, intelligent approach to Catholic thought, this was the name. I approached Regis College. I wrote to some of my Jesuit buddies there who are teachers there, and I said, who would recommend? Who would you recommend that would be able to give us that kind of a presentation? And this is who they sent us. So
It helps that I was within driving distance.
yeah, it helps that he was in Regina. Brett, your presentation is both thought-provoking and encouraging in many ways, because it helps us realize that the questions that we face in our world from a Catholic perspective are difficult questions, and that there are no easy answers, but rather answers that challenge us to probe deeply into our relationship with God and to explore how we can respond faithfully to that relationship, to the presence of God in our life. You've challenged us to believe thoughtfully and to think faithfully, so that we can, in fact, bring a balanced and gospel-based approach to all of those very difficult questions that exercise us and tax us in our work of education. So thank you very much for giving us this inspiring and challenging way of looking at our responsibility of thinking about the faith tradition of which we are so much a part, and how we can share that with our students. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today.